Thank you all for joining the Mackinac Center for Public Policy in conjunction with the National Review Institute today for our virtual event series as we continue. Today's topic is State Economic Development Programs, Why Feed Sparrows Through a Horse? I'd like to start things off just by reminding all of you as our guests that there is a question and answers box that you can feel free to type questions into throughout our event today. We will get to as many questions as we can by the end of the program for our speakers to address directly. Those that we do not answer, we will follow up with an email and do our best to connect with those of you who we have contact information for. Thank you again for the thoughtful discussion we're about to have. And I will start things off by introducing Mackinac Center President Joe Lehman for a brief update on happenings at the center.
Thank you, Caleb, and thank you to all the Mackinac Center friends and supporters who joined us today. You should be really proud of your Mackinac Center support. We have been recognized by the national group of think tanks in all the states, the State Policy Network. We've been recognized for 3 awards recently by that group. One of those awards was for a marketing campaign that actually depicted some of Michigan Governor Whitmer's executive orders and the absurdity of some of her pandemic-related executive orders, and it depicted them in the form of cartoons. And so we were able to use humor to get some of our points across, and at one point we noticed that just about every time we would issue a new cartoon, she would revise one of the orders that fixed the problem that we had identified with it. For example, one of the cartoons was you can take a walk on a golf course carrying a walking stick if you want to, but you can't walk on a golf course carrying a golf club. Well, that just lends itself very, very neatly to poking a little fun, which we did. And the State Policy Network, along with the Roop Foundation of California, recognized the Mackinac Center's research and ideas in education. And it awarded the Mackinac Center our Ed Prize. And it was for an idea that was led by our Director of Education Policy, Ben DeGrow. And the idea is simply that the education dollars that are taxed from the people and then used to provide an education for school children, those dollars should be available for parents, especially at a time like this when the schools themselves are, in some cases, not really providing any services, particularly for special needs students. They're providing a patchwork, and I know that everyone is familiar with the problems this is causing. So it was nice to see the Mackinac Center research recognized, and we were also recognized for with State Policy Network's Network Award. That was for our work with 7 other state think tanks around the country working in a healthcare working group where we collaborated and put ideas in front of governors and legislators so that those decision makers could know how to respond to the healthcare crisis that really started to unfold in a big way in March. Mike Van Beek, our Director of Research, published a study that outlines Michigan's Emergency Powers Act of 1945, which is the one that Governor Whitmer cites as the source of her authority for making decisions with no end date on the length of the emergency. And so under this law, according to her interpretation, she is able to make decisions without legislative input for as long as she says an emergency exists, and that's just up to her to determine. And so that's why we had sued the governor through the Mackinac Center Legal Foundation, and we were at the Michigan Supreme Court a couple weeks ago. I think it was 2 weeks ago today, and something remarkable happened there. We were asking the court to decide if the governor's assertion of these extraordinary, unlimited powers was a violation of the Constitution with respect to the three branches of government, and the legislature perhaps should have a role too. And the Supreme Court heard our arguments and the governor's arguments for more than 3.5 hours. And that's what was remarkable. Usually those arguments are scheduled for much less than that, maybe around an hour. We had to look back more than a century to find a time when many hours were given to oral arguments at the state Supreme Court. At that time, they set aside an entire day. So the justices were definitely taking seriously our issues, and they've asked us to brief them further. And so we're waiting really any time for a decision there. And I actually had a personal brush with the governor's power this week. I happen to be traveling. I'm here in a hotel room, and I had a personal doctor's appointment with doctors at the University of Michigan, and we had decided to do this appointment over a video conference. But because I was traveling, and we didn't figure this out until I was already at my destination, because I was traveling, the law did not allow a teleconference that would have been perfectly legal inside the state of Michigan. So I could not get the medical service that I need through this appointment, and it's because the governor reversed one of the Mackinac Center's ideas that she had originally adopted early on in the pandemic to lighten up on the restrictions on what's called telemedicine. So these are real problems that affect real people. And the Mackinac Center is at the forefront of challenging what we believe is a serious overreach of power by the governor. Some of you may also be aware of a personal situation with me. I did have COVID. I contracted the virus, and all better now. But my personal report is that the virus is real, and it did set me back on my heels. I was never hospitalized or close to it, but it made me very, very glad to be strong and healthy again. So be careful out there. The virus is real, and take reasonable precautions in going about your day-to-day activities. So thanks again for joining us. Thanks for your support, and I turn it now back over to Caleb for the rest of the show.
All right, thank you, Joe, and we're glad to have you back in full health and with us today. And I will begin, before we pass it off to our keynote panel discussion today, I'll give some background on who you'll be hearing from. Kevin Hassett is the Senior Advisor to the National Review Capital Matters and served at the 29th, he was the 29th Chairman of the President's Council of Economic Advisors, a role he began in 2017, and rejoined the White House this spring as a Senior Advisor to President Trump. We are also joined by Mike LaFaive. Mike is the Senior Director of Fiscal Policy here at the Mackinac Center, and he has co-authored 5 economic development studies and has some expertise in that area as well. And additionally, we have Chris D'Ansamino with us. He is the Director of Regional Development at the National Review Institute. And Chris, why don't you tell us a little bit about the National Review Institute's mission, and we will move forward with our discussion.
Sure. Thank you, Caleb. Thank you, Joe. I'll be very brief in my remarks so we can get to the main show. But for those of you who don't know National Review Institute or myself, my name is Chris D'Ansamino. I'm Director of Regional Development. I live here in Milwaukee, although National Review and National Review Institute are both out of New York City. Normally, we would be partnering with Mackinac in Michigan. So unfortunately, we can't do that this time, but absolutely appreciate the generosity of this partnership. Congratulations, Joe, on the accolades you mentioned, the accomplishments that Mackinac has had recently. For those of you that don't know much about National Review Institute, just a couple of quick words on it. We were founded in 1991 by William F. Buckley, Jr., and our mission is to advance the conservative principles which he championed, as well as support National Review Magazine's mission. Our educational programs bring leaders together from all walks of life to promote the principles of a free society. Like I said, one of the ways we do that is by partnering with great state-based think tanks like yourselves. Do dozens, almost 100 a year, partnership events like this, and we're looking forward to getting back in person with that. Kevin Hassett, as you mentioned, is one of our senior advisors to our new Capital Matters project, and we're pleased to bring him to you today, to our friends in Michigan. Before I turn it back to you, Caleb, I did want to pitch one of our upcoming events that we have, and that's our William F. Buckley Jr. Prize Gala on October 5th. This is an exquisite event. It's our key fundraiser of the year. Normally we move it around the country. It was slated to be in New York City this year, but unfortunately for obvious reasons, it will be a virtual at-home gala. But I think it's going to be a very exciting event. We're going to have more people than ever before because of the fact that it's remote to join us. And this year we're honoring two great Americans, James Buckley, brother to William F. Buckley and former U.S. Senator Virginia James, a great philanthropist and leader in the conservative movement. So for those of you on the call today, I do hope you'll join us. You can visit nrinstitute.org to learn more about us, our programming, and that event in particular. So again, thank you, Joe. Thank you, Caleb, and I'll turn it back to you.
All right. Thanks, Chris. And we will begin our discussion today with Kevin and Mike. And I just want to remind all of our attendees that you are welcome to type in any questions on economic development programs and incentive programs as they come to mind in the Q&A box there. And we will get to, again, as many as we can. And those that we may not have time to address, we'll reach out personally after the event. So as we kick things off, I'll put the ball in Kevin's court and like to get Mike's take on it as well. But how and when did these incentive programs begin?
Kevin? Yeah. Oh, yeah. Can you hear me now, guys?
Yes.
Yeah. I think states have been competing for businesses for as long as there has been a union. In fact, sort of the founding principle really of our country was that sort of competition between states for things, for citizens, would be a way to sort of ensure liberty, because if, one state started to be kind of crazy, then people could move to another state. I think that one of the things that happens, and of course Mike's the world's leading expert on this and has an amazing study that came out in August about it. One of the things that's happened though is that over time, a lot of states have cut their sort of corporate taxes down to almost nothing. And so they're an attractive place to go just because you can go locate there and not have to pay much tax. But other states, and I think Michigan sort of qualifies, have pretty high state corporate income taxes, so they're not very attractive places on a tax basis to locate. And so then what happens is then it's often very liberal governments that do this is they come up with a whole bunch of sort of sideways. And it's astonishing how many different such programs pursued over the years. And it's really great that Mackinac has spent so much effort evaluating them, because you can see that they're not really very effective. They're very costly. And, we're going to talk a lot about that today. I'll hand it over to you and to Mike to go into the details.
Kevin, you're absolutely right that this really began with the founding of our nation. Alexander Hamilton is sometimes credited with founding the first government-subsidized industrial park in New Jersey. So that goes back quite a ways. And his dear friend George Washington, as president, started a state-owned enterprise. He actually his administration ran a government fur factory in competition with the private sector. So this has been going on since the founding. The modern war between the states over jobs really is often traced by scholars to Mississippi during the Great Depression. The governor there passed a state law that would allow local units of government to float what are called industrial revenue bonds. It's basically a cheaper way of coming up with capital for investment in industry. And the idea back then was to build these buildings less expensively in an attempt to lure northern manufacturing south and try to alleviate some of the unemployment that the entire nation was suffering under, but just for Mississippi. Incidentally, since Mississippi created these industrial revenue bonds, they've become ubiquitous around the country. Every state has had them for a very long time. And of course, it kicked off the birth of state-level economic development programs around the country. Just last August, an organization called it was a nonprofit, it was a community development and economic research, tallied up more than 2,100 state-level economic development programs that now exist around the country and American territories in order to create jobs where they think they might not otherwise exist if the market was just left to its own devices.
And I'd like to have you build on a few more things, Mike. I mentioned in your introduction that you've co-authored 5 studies on economic development programs that were Michigan specific. What does the broader field of research say?
Well, it's very robust. If you look at the academic literature, literally on any subject, there's quite a variety of conclusions about this program or that program or this subject or that subject. But there's rarely an instance, in my opinion, where there's so much consensus around a particular topic. Because there's been so many economic development programs created over the years, there's been opportunities for economists and others, political scientists, for instance, budget officers, to study these programs in detail, and they have for decades. It's all there in the academic literature, and I think the preponderance of it shows that these programs have a 0 to negative impact. They really do not get much in the way of applause or conclusions drawn by these scholars that these programs are an effective tool for creating economic growth and development. My favorite study comes out of 2004. There were 2 economists out of Iowa who swept into their orbit, about directly and indirectly, some 300 other economic development studies. So an analysis of a program in Arizona, in New York, and that sort of thing ends up in these literature reviews. So they did a literature review of the literature review. And so over these 300, they read them, they categorized them, they analyzed their findings, and they could not help but conclude by publishing an economic development article called The Failures of Economic Development Incentives. And in fact, hoping you'd ask me a question like this, I actually printed out 1 page from it. I'd like to read to you from one of their studies. They write, "The most fundamental problem is that many public officials appear to believe that they can influence the course of their state and local economies through incentives and subsidies far beyond anything supported by even the most optimistic evidence. And in my literature reviews since that time, I've seen nothing to suggest that things have improved for those who advocate these economic development programs. If anything, the pace of the literature criticizing such programs has only picked up. The rate has picked up. More recently, there's been a number of studies coming from the academic community, one of which looked at economic development deals, something like 2,600 of them over 35 states, going back to 1990. And they found that companies that had been subsidized added employment at a slower rate than like companies that had not been subsidized.
And Kevin, if you could take the lead on this, why do so many programs fail to perform as advertised?
Yeah. Something I've been studying throughout my career, and it's an issue in the U.S. And way back in the early 1990s, Alan Auerbach, an economist at Berkeley, and I did a careful study of basically investment and location incentives in Sweden, of all places. And basically one of the things that we found was that governments tended, it's kind of like the way to think about the way that governments, especially left-leaning governments with do-gooding incentives in their minds, is that think about it as like a playground. And then, the neighborhood decides, we need better equipment for the kids. And so they put a bunch of new equipment in the playground. And then a new administration comes in and they want to add some equipment too. But they don't take down the old equipment, they add some new equipment. And before you know it, you get a playground that's like so densely covered with equipment that it's really hard for the kids to play. And so what happens is that they'll try one thing with one company, another thing with another company. And Mike probably knows, I remember reading in your piece, I just forget the number, but there've been 30 something such different programs in Michigan. And so did I get the number right, Mike? It was 35 or
Yeah, it depends on how far you go back, but there's been dozens. And it's old wine in a new skin frequently. The name changes, they tweak something about the policy, but is ultimately a transfer of wealth from one to another.
Right. But again, the main point is that first they build these really, really complicated structures. And so it's like hard to enforce, hard to adhere to. Those costs are very, very significant. And, it'd be much smoother to just cut the corporate rate and make yourself a more attractive place for business. But, left-wing governments can't do that because they've sort of bought into the old kind of Molly Maguire view that like businesses are bad, and unless the government is really, really putting their finger into their activities, then they're going to be abusing workers and so on, and so that they really, really want to control the business with complicated programs. I think that the way to think about it in terms of a state like Michigan is that there'll be a high tax if you're deciding to locate in Michigan, a high state corporate tax, but then they might like give you some programs, some program help to help reduce the effect of the tax. But on balance, you're probably not going to come out ahead enough so that it would really make sense to go to Michigan as opposed to some other state with a lower rate.
And Mike, could you unpack for our viewers some of the findings in the August recent study that we've referenced a couple times here?
Sure. The Mackinac Center had a chance to get its hands on a wonderful database known as the National Establishment Time Series Database. And it's actually a census of American business that tracks employment and sales at companies across the United States and over time. Once it receives what's called a DUNS number, that company is tracked regardless of where it moves to, or if it expands, if it goes from having one corporate location to a corporate location with satellite locations. It also allows us to track super small, medium, and large corporations. So we took that database and we thought, well, how can we use this to our greatest advantage? And we did so by creating our own database of Michigan economic growth or Michigan economic incentive deals that go back to 1983. Our first database that we created had something like 7,300 deals. And we ended up whittling that number down a bit because some deals were so small it wasn't worth keeping them. 10% of them had deals worth only $3,300 on average. And then we went and we tried to match those deals with the corporations or businesses that we found in this census of American business. And we were able to match up to 2,400 of them. For our first analysis, we looked at 1,900 deals. And we said, well, what does their connection in this NETS database tell us about whether or not they added jobs or not? And did they add them relative to businesses that were like in stature, whether they were a corporate location or a branch or the size, and were unsubsidized? And what we found was the subsidy programs here in Michigan actually did contribute to businesses adding payroll to their employment rolls. On average, it was about 7% higher than like companies that had not received an incentive over time. However, the incentives that had to be offered were staggering. I mean, really breathtaking. We found that for every job created by one of these programs, on balance, the big picture, the state had to offer almost $600,000 worth of financial incentives to create that one job. Now we use the term offered because the state lacks transparency in its reporting often, and we simply could not know at times whether or not the payout actually happened. We just know that the money was offered in many cases. We then actually broke down the studies into specific programs or groups of programs in 9 categories. And we found that in one of them, there was an explicitly negative connection between the subsidy and jobs. In other words, job losses occurred after the deals were struck at these particular businesses. That was for an older company. We found no impact from another 5 of them. We couldn't find whether there was a negative impact or a positive impact. One would think with all the money that was being offered up, there'd be some measurement there, some way to suggest that, in fact, jobs had been born or died. And then in 3 areas, 2 programs and 1 program area, we found a very positive response between the subsidies and adding employment growth to their employment rolls. However, they also came at a huge cost. The 21st Century Jobs Fund in Michigan had a range of between $275,000 per job created in terms of incentives offered, up to over $300,000. The Michigan Economic Growth Authority program, a long-running program here in the state of Michigan. Every job it created cost about $125,000 worth of incentives offered. And then the Michigan Business Development Program cost about $29,400 worth of incentives offered per year on average to create one job. So an extraordinary cost associated with these programs, and when you consider it in terms of opportunity cost, the next best opportunity foregone, perhaps the cost was even higher. You could have probably banked money paid out to create these jobs in our savings account at zero interest and done better. You could have fixed more roads, filled more potholes, or even rolled back the state's personal income tax with that kind of money. So these programs are very expensive. They redirect precious resources away from higher priorities, and they should be reined in to a greater degree than they have been recently.
All right, and this next one's for both of you to go back and forth on a bit. What can we do to really rein in the repackaging an old wineskins mentality? Is there any hope that we are seeing policymakers take note that these incentive programs don't pan out to be all they're made up to be? And what are the policy solutions you would recommend?
Well, Mike, since you just spoke, why did I go first? I think that again, I sort of alluded earlier to if you're doing really, really complicated things to attract new businesses, then you should think about why you have to do that. There are a lot of places that don't have to do. And so, it could be, as Mike mentioned, that businesses don't want to locate in your state because you've got a decaying infrastructure. It could be that businesses don't want to locate in your state because you've got bad schools. It could be that they don't want to locate in your state because you've got high taxes. And I think that addressing those big problems is the way to fix the fact that you don't have a vibrant, new business, new startup community, and that coming up with tricks to end around that is extremely expensive. And one way that that Mike's result is correct about like how much money is spent per job is that. I did some calculations that still get buzzed about on the internet because as a conservative, it's sort of odd that I made this point. But if you look at the President Obama's stimulus during the Great Recession, then the cost per job created was humongous in the millions. And so if you really are worried about creating jobs in a recession, then you could create jobs indirectly by building bridges, say. But the bridges take a long time, and you're spending a lot of money on the bridge. But if you're really worried about jobs, that if you just hired people, then it's way, way cheaper because you could pay them the median wage, and the job creation cost would be much, much lower. And so again, like think about it. That for the typical cost in Mike's study per job, that if you're really worried about jobs, you could just have the state hire them. And you'd get 10 times as many workers given the median wage in Michigan as you would through these indirect programs.
Yeah, very good answer. We named this talk, "Are we feeding sparrows through a horse?" And I'm afraid that in many cases we are, because one of the reasons that these programs don't create the jobs that people think they will is because there's an expensive bureaucracy in the middle of every transaction. So if you'd like to, help out and help them live better, fuller lives, more nutritious ones, you can allow them to pick their own seed, or you can run it through a horse first and let them pick what remains when the horse is finished itself. That's just one of the problems associated with these programs. So across the board types of changes, what we call a fair field and no favors, is a much better approach to economic growth and development. We had to beat people back at Michigan's borders long before the state ever got into picking winners and losers in the marketplace through these programs. Humorously, here in Michigan in the 1940s, it was Kim Sigler after World War II who gave a State of the State address, and he railed against all these federal planners that were running around the state of Michigan, and his response was to instead have state planners, and then he created one of the state's first post-World War II economic development programs. Extraordinary waste of money. Other solutions to this, solutions to reining in the problem of these economic development wars, this war between the states, in my view, would include not only continuing to produce studies like we produce, because facts indeed are stubborn things, and we keep showing different academics using different data sets from different angles that these programs are ineffective. I'd also recommend trying to see lawmakers mandate greater transparency and accountability for the bureaucracies that are in charge of these programs. Here in Michigan, there's incentives that have been given out, tens of millions of dollars, and we can't know how much of that has been paid out, and in some cases, to what companies. Furthermore, in terms of accountability, time and again, we've seen the bureaucracy sort of profit from issuing a press release saying, jobs are coming, we've created all these jobs. But they're silent when their deal fails to produce those jobs, cost tens of millions of dollars to the taxpayer, little of which is clawed back as a result of their contractual agreements with the companies to get that money back. It's hard to squeeze blood from a stone in companies that go bankrupt. These winners that have been chosen by economic development bureaucrats, sometimes at the end of the day, they just don't have the money to pay back. So I would recommend greater transparency, greater accountability for the bureaucrats, recommending across-the-board changes, and something that is old but new again for those of us arguing for restraint, and that is a state compact that allows the political class in each state capital to jump together against economic development programs. Time and again, we hear them say, we can't unilaterally disarm because if Michigan disarms, Ohio could just steal our jobs. We won't have any tools to fight them. In fact, a compact gives them a chance to talk about multilateral disarmament, where politicians hold hands and jump together, and then their anti-corporate welfare decisions can be enforced through a contract in courts of law. We think that holds real promise. Mackinac Center is working on it. Others are working on it around the state. I think some 13 states have adopted a compact, and I hope that others will too. And we'll see how that plays out.
Good. Now, this question dovetails well into some of the comments on transparency and what other states are doing. So I'll let either of you take the lead on this, but Kevin may have a perspective with some of the national outlook. Considering the research for states that had big economic incentive programs, have any abandoned them altogether in favor of a more transparent and even tax system?
Yeah, the thing I wanted to say just before to follow up on what Mike was just saying is that the way to think about what Michigan's been doing is that they, rather than have like a really smart venture capitalist decide like where we should invest our money because we want to have a future that's very promising in Michigan. We all wish that for Michigan. And so there's going to be a whole bunch of new businesses in Michigan 5, 6, 7 years from now. And they're going to be doing things that right now they probably don't even exist yet, a lot of them, right? And so the point is that who should be picking like which businesses are going to be the ones that get like the favors from the government. And my view, and I think Mike's view, is nobody. But if you have a bureaucrat deciding, hey, number 3, number 14, and number 28, those are the businesses that we think are the future of Michigan. Bureaucrat decide like the future of Michigan looks like at spotting promising businesses, then he'd be running a venture capital fund and making money, not working in a bureaucracy somewhere, right? And so you're basically giving the choice of like how we head towards the future to a bureaucrat that has no clue or no better clue than anybody other than like an expert in the field. But it's worse because So what the bureaucrat then does, in order to give the favors to the businesses that they like, and I'm reminded of Solyndra at the federal level, then what the bureaucrat then has to do is he has to pay for it. You got a balanced budget requirement, and the way that the bureaucrat pays for it is by lifting taxes on the ones who don't get the money, by lifting taxes on everybody. And so you end up with this world where the sort of creative destruction that you need in a healthy capitalist economy gets squashed by the high taxes and the special favors. And I'm also very, very concerned that this is something that I want, Mike, when we get back to you, I wonder if you've noticed it. But because there is no transparency, because there are millions of dollars flowing about, there must be an enormous amount of corruption. in this. So there's got to be that there's a heck of a lot of weird stuff going on with revolving doors, perhaps, or side payments. In terms of the states that do it well, you could basically there are high tax blue states and low tax red states. And the low tax red states, businesses are moving to the low tax red states like crazy. And I don't know if there's a low tax blue state. I can't think of one right now. I don't know the state tax data like completely like an encyclopedia, but I think that basically the general pattern in the data is that the really high tax, high regulatory states that are trying to offset those high taxes and regulations with these weird little programs are failing, and that they're losing businesses like crazy.
The state has abandoned their incentive programs once they've been created altogether, but we've certainly seen them reined in and sometimes dramatically. For a long time, I looked to Florida, which I thought was doing a great job, and redirecting the incentives they did use to areas that would improve many businesses instead of just one or two. In fact, it's much harder to get an incentive deal in Florida now than it used to be. And they also insisted on a superior analysis of each deal when they did go down. The state bureaucrats there had a model constructed that was designed to make Florida's economy. It was very dynamic, and perhaps alone among other states, they were running opportunity cost analyses. They were saying, well, we could do this deal with this company with this amount of money, or we could buy a basket of public goods, or maybe even cut taxes. How would our model react under those circumstances? And let's subtract any job creation from them from what we think this business will create, and then make the decision accordingly. So I think they've been much more judicious than other states. Now, Michigan in recent last few years has improved. They scrapped their worst program, the Michigan Economic Growth Authority. They let another one sunset that was only a couple of years old. And just recently, last year, Governor Whitmer vetoed funding of the state's Pure Michigan program, and you've probably seen their advertisements nationwide. That went from being $37.5 million to zero overnight, in part due to the budget constraints imposed on us by the COVID virus. Now, Kevin has mentioned a few times that the states might just be abating taxes on a willy-nilly basis to offset their overall high burdens. And the fact is, there is academic scholarship from more than one group in different states that provide evidence for that assertion. So there's lots that can be done, and the fair field and no favors approach is probably the best place to start.
Very good. Well, I will take a stab at this next question. Go ahead, Mike.
Well, Kevin had brought up the issue of the lack of transparency causing corruption. We've seen that here in the state of Michigan. We've seen it outside the state of Michigan. In fact, I think in Ohio, they're dealing with a current case like that. And we've also seen this whole idea of increasing amount of rent seeking, which is favor seeking in government, bring in players who aren't necessarily being completely upfront with those who hand out the incentives. Rent seeking is basically a way of saying favor seeking, and it's a come and get it. People like Richard Short here in Michigan will go looking for favors when they don't really have the best intentions. For those of you who haven't heard of our case here about Richard Short, years ago the state bureaucracy offered him $7 million worth of incentives. And only after they held a big press conference with the governor did they find out that he was a convicted felon out on parole for financial crimes, and who by the terms of his parole was not even allowed to possess a debit card. Now, this is an incentive given to this fellow by people who claim that they can centrally plan our economy by properly picking winners from losers in the marketplace, when they can't even Google the guy's name and see that his felon record would come up as the first or second Google link when they do so.
All right, well, I will take a stab at this. It's a little different topic, but perhaps not. Are there any organizations fighting Governor Whitmer on her many overreaches? We did have a virtual event about a week or two ago on this very topic, and that is available on our event page and on our YouTube channel as well. And the answer to that, Joe Lehman alluded to in the introduction, there is a case that the Mackinac Center worked with an outside legal counsel on that has the potential to challenge all of the executive orders beyond the first 28 days, and the oral arguments were had at the state Supreme Court, and we are expecting a decision in the coming days, weeks at most. And there is another organization doing a petition drive. They have the signatures, from what I understand, but it's the terms of submission, or when the Secretary of State responds to that or submits that, is could be a longer timetable than many who signed would like. So there are some organizations working on those things. We have another question on incentives from there's a watch party going on up in the Traverse Bay area with a 912 group. And the question is, incentives could perhaps be treated as a loan. Produce the jobs or pay the loan back. Produce the jobs and the loan could be forgiven. Thoughts on this change in structure?
It's not a change. It exists here in the state of Michigan. It's called the Michigan Business Development Program. It is either an outright grant program or a loan program, and sometimes the grant converts to a loan. In fact, there was a deal of that sort, I believe, with cherry growers here in Traverse City, out in actually it was in Grawn, where it would have been paid back plus additional revenues to the Michigan Economic Development Corporation, which, by the way, they could have used for other economic development incentives. And it failed. The state of Michigan declared this particular opportunity a big winner in the marketplace in the middle of one of the greatest fruit crop losses in the United States, and perhaps in recent history, last decades. And it goes to show you the difficulty that bureaucrats have in picking winners and losers in the marketplace. Even with all this information in front of them, big crop failure, they bet a couple $1 million of our money on an incentive package in Grawn that did not pan out, and we did not get our money back through the bankruptcy process.
All right, and the losers are existing companies that pay higher taxes. Have any existing companies or groups of existing companies paying those higher taxes tried paring back the incentives in favor of lowering rates for all? Kevin, take the lead on this. And
Well, again, I'm not sure about. Mike knows the facts on the ground in Michigan, but nationwide, that's something that the Business Roundtable and the Chamber of Commerce have been advocating for a really good long time. And so if you go back to the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act passed by President Trump, it was also highly motivated by the same sort of thing, that the U.S. was the highest corporate tax place on earth, and so it wasn't just a problem of like a business going to locate in Ohio versus Michigan, but it was Ireland versus the U.S. And so we cut the corporate tax rate dramatically and got a huge surge in investment and in location of activity back in the U.S. And it was really just all about the rate. And at the same time that we did that, we pursued aggressive deregulation to make ourselves more attractive to businesses. I was just looking at the numbers, and they have this term of art in the federal government of an economically significant regulation. And President Obama's 8 years saw the production of almost 500 of those. And in President Trump's 4 years, it looks like there's going to be 16 new regulations, just 16, and a whole bunch more, that net negative because a whole bunch were rolled back. And so I think the really, really successful country strategy, and this is shown in the international data, and it's been proven by the data here in the U.S., go about, cleaning out the stables. I guess we're using too many horse analogies, and just cut the rate and lower regulation.
Good. And I know, I don't know if we have a delay in the connection here or not, but Mike's going to take that question as well on whether groups have tried paring back incentives in favor of lower taxes for all. And I'll add to that, is there a penalty if businesses don't follow through on their promises?
Okay. First question is, small businesses and medium-sized, even larger ones, have been opposed to these, some in public, and often with me in private. They're openly hostile to these types of programs, but they're building their own businesses and don't want to rock the boat, so to speak, with any level of government over incentives if they can avoid getting into a public squabble. Now, down in southeast Michigan, we've seen a company actually receive an incentive and then give it back and say, look, this should go to local schools and that sort of thing. We thought we would need it to cover the cost of a government mandate, so we took it. But now that this mandate that we thought we'd have to deal with doesn't exist anymore, we should just give it back. And I think corporate leaders like that deserve something of a Profiles and Courage Award for responding that way. Your follow-up question, Caleb, you had a second one for me?
Yes. Is there incentive, or are businesses who don't fulfill their promises rather on these programs, are they penalized in any way?
Many deals come with clauses. They're called clawbacks, where the state mandates that the corporation pay them back, say if they should leave the state. What I've seen is that clawbacks are real, but they're not as real as they should be. In fact, in meeting minutes, I've seen boards that hand out the incentives and who had a chance to claw the money back say, well, we could claw this money back, but I mean, the notes seem like, well, what's a little loss between friends, and they let it go. But they should not. I've seen time and again companies promise the sun, the moon, and the stars because they have an economic incentive to do so. But when they short their performance, don't want or leave, don't want to pay the money back, or are not in a position to pay the money back because they've gone into bankruptcy.
And is there any possibility that there would be legal challenges to specific incentive programs that could be mounted, particularly citing the equal protections clause or arguments?
I'm happy to go first, but Kevin, if you'd like that, I'd be happy to step aside.
I don't really have an opinion about the legality of this stuff. Yeah.
There's a great case that everyone should be aware of. It's called Cuno versus Daimler Chrysler. At least that's how it's known. Charlotte Cuno filed a lawsuit, I think it was in Toledo, against one of the big three under the Interstate Commerce Clause, saying, look, you can't put up these tariffs, basically, what they are, and basically force us to pay more for these corporations in our taxes than we otherwise would have. And I believe it went to an appellate court level back in the 90s, early aughts. And unfortunately, Cuno lost her case against Daimler Chrysler because the court argued that taxpayers do not have standing in the court of law on this issue. So that direction failed, and it was not the only lawsuit that failed. However, there are other approaches that can be taken regarding lawsuits, gift clauses, and that sort of thing. The state of Michigan actually has a long history with a specific amendment passed in 1850 that prohibits the state from taking a public interest in a private company. Unfortunately, that amendment has been watered down to almost nothing through a series of really bad court cases. And we've written a full study about it, if you'd like to see it on our website. And we think that in the future, there are opportunities for us to re-challenge that and make that amendment as powerful as it used to be anyway. Also, our compact that we've drafted for states to sign on to specifically allows taxpayer standing in a court of law to help keep states within the compact. So we're trying to address the legal matters, and we think eventually we could win. But right now in Michigan, there's not an ongoing case.
Good. Well, I know we have a few minutes left here, and I'd like to open the floor to both Kevin and Mike just to make any final remarks and points on our topic today.
Kevin, would you like to?
Yes, I can follow up. So the standing question. Yeah, can you hear me? The standing question feels very unusual to me, because if the government were going to burn $1 billion, right, then and they're going to suppose they commit to burn $1 billion forever every year, then the taxpayers are going to have to pay for that $1 billion. And so I don't quite understand how taxpayers don't have standing if governments are wasting money. Maybe that's the difference between a lawyer and an economist, but it feels to me like it completely doesn't make any sense. But then in terms of closing remarks, I just first want to thank you guys for the amazing work that you do. That I've relied on it often over the years, especially when I was in the White House and looking at specific state policies. Thanks to the National Review Institute for finding such a great partner. And I think that the basic principle that generalizes outside of this event that I'd like to emphasize one last time is that if you're a really high tax environment, that you're going to get negative consequences from that. And the way to respond to that is to lower the taxes and make yourself more attractive as a location for businesses. And that if you try to do it through all sorts of clever subsidies and so on, then you're going to end up wasting a heck of a lot of money.
I'd just like to wrap up by saying, look, the evidence shows that these are ineffective and very expensive programs, not just in terms of their direct costs, but in terms of their opportunity costs. They're also, and we haven't mentioned this at all yet, fundamentally unfair because we're making lots of people and businesses pay for the incentives provided to a few. These programs don't work because they rob Peter to pay Paul. They run that money through an expensive bureaucracy, which takes its own cut, very expensive bureaucracy frequently. They might have political motivations instead of purely economic ones. They encourage rent seeking, which is like throwing sand in the gears of the economy. It's a very inefficient way for governments and economies to operate. And lastly, it's just too difficult to pick winners and losers in the marketplace. To grasp an economy in all its nuance and detail and have some central bureaucrats try to improve it through a coercive method like these incentive programs and have things turn out in a way that would be better than if we had just left everyone to their own devices. A free market, a fair field and no favors is the way to facilitate economic growth and development. The evidence is very clear about that. I want to drive home the point about this being unfair. We have a company in Flint that's been paying full freight for 100 years called Kogel Meats. They woke up one day and heard their state government advertising and bragging about how they were bringing this competition, Kogel Meats competition, from New York to Michigan. And they thought, who am I working for that my tax dollars would be used to subsidize my competition?
Well, I want to thank you both again for your time and thank the National Review Institute and Kevin and Chris for joining us today and our own Mike LaFaive as well. And thank you to all of our attendees who joined us live as we hosted this event. And I know many of you will want to share this with friends, colleagues, and family members, and you can do so at mackinac.org/events. That will be posted in the short term here. And again, I always like to remind our guests too, and many of you are aware that we are a 501c3 at the Mackinac Center and are able to put events like this on and continue to lead on some key policy initiatives because of the support of individuals and business owners and members and foundations and so forth as well. So thank you for all that support us. Thank you again for all of your time. And we look forward to seeing you next time.